or at any rate to 1933. A new movement, which has gradually developed into the antithesis of liberalism, begins with Rousseau, and acquires strength from the Romantic movement and the principle of nationality. In this movement, individualism is extended from the intellectual sphere to that of the passions, and the anarchic aspects of individualism are made explicit. The cult of the hero, as developed by Carlyle and Nietzsche, is typical of this philosophy. Various elements were combined in it. There was dislike of early industrialism, hatred of the ugliness that it produced, and revulsion against its cruelties. There was a nostalgia for the Middle Ages, which were idealized owing to hatred of the modern world. There was an attempt to combine championship of the fading privileges of church and aristocracy with defense of wage earners against the tyranny of manufacturers. There was a vehement assertion of the right of rebellion in the name of nationalism, and of the splendor of war in defense of liberty. Byron was the poet of this movement. Fichte, Carlyle, and Nietzsche were its philosophers. But since we cannot all have the career of heroic leaders, and cannot all make our individual will prevail, this philosophy, like all other forms of anarchism, inevitably leads, when adopted, to the despotic government of the most successful hero. And when his tyranny is established, he will suppress in others the self-assertive ethic by which he has risen to power. This whole theory of life, therefore, is self-refuting, in the sense that its adoption in practice leads to the realization of something utterly different, a dictatorial state in which the individual is severely repressed. There is yet another philosophy, which in the main is an offshoot of liberalism, namely that of Marx. I shall consider him at a later stage, but for the moment he is merely to be borne in mind. The first comprehensive statement of the liberal philosophy is to be found in Locke, the most influential, though by no means the most profound, of modern philosophers. In England his views were so completely in harmony with those of most intelligent men that it is difficult to trace their influence except in theoretical philosophy. In France, on the other hand, where they led to an opposition to the existing regime in practice and to the prevailing Cartesianism in theory, they clearly had a considerable effect in shaping the course of events. This is an example of a general principle, a philosophy developed in a politically and economically advanced country, which is, in its birthplace, little more than a clarification and systematization of prevalent opinion, may become elsewhere a source of revolutionary ardor and, ultimately, of actual revolution. It is mainly through theorists that the maxims regulating the policy of advanced countries become known to less advanced countries. In the advanced countries, practice inspires theory. In the others, theory inspires practice. This difference is one of the reasons why transplanted ideas are seldom so successful as they were in their native soil. Before considering the philosophy of Locke, let us review some of the circumstances in 17th century England that were influential in forming his opinions. The conflict between king and parliament in the Civil War gave Englishmen once for all a love of compromise and moderation, and a fear of pushing any theory to its logical conclusion, which has dominated them down to the present time. The principles for which the Long Parliament contended had at first the support of a large majority. They wished to abolish the king's right to grant trade monopolies, and to make him acknowledge the exclusive right of Parliament to impose taxes. They desired liberty within the Church of England for opinions and practices which were persecuted by Archbishop Laud. They held that Parliament should meet at stated intervals, and should not be convoked only on rare occasions when the king found its collaboration indispensable. They objected to arbitrary arrest, and to the subservience of the judges to the royal wishes. But many, while prepared to agitate for these ends, were not prepared to levy war against the king, which appeared to them an act of treason and impiety. As soon as actual war broke out, the division of forces became more nearly equal. The political development from the outbreak of the Civil War to the establishment of Cromwell as Lord Protector followed the course which has now become familiar, but was then unprecedented. The parliamentary party consisted of two factions, the Presbyterians and the Independents. The Presbyterians desired to preserve a state church, but to abolish bishops. The Independents agreed with them about bishops, but held that each congregation should be free to choose its own theology, without the interference of any central ecclesiastical government. The Presbyterians in the main were of a higher social class than the Independents, and their political opinions were more moderate. They wished to come to terms with the king as soon as defeat had made him conciliatory. Their policy, however, was rendered impossible by two circumstances. First, the king developed a martyr's stubbornness about bishops. Second, the defeat of the king proved difficult, and was only achieved by Cromwell's new model army, which consisted of independents. Consequently, when the king's military resistance was broken, he could still not be induced to make a treaty, and the Presbyterians had lost the preponderance of armed forces in the parliamentary armies. The defense of democracy had thrown power into the hands of a minority, and it used its power with a complete disregard for democracy and parliamentary government. When Charles I had attempted to arrest the 5 members, there had been a universal outcry, and his failure had made him ridiculous. But Cromwell had no such difficulties. By Pride's purge, he dismissed about 100 Presbyterian members and obtained for a time a subservient majority. When finally he decided to dismiss Parliament altogether, not a dog barked. War had made only military force seem important, and had produced a contempt for constitutional forms. For the rest of Cromwell's life, the government of England was a military tyranny, hated by an increasing majority of the nation, but impossible to shake off while his partisans alone were armed. Charles II, after hiding in oak trees and living as a refugee in Holland, determined at the Restoration that he would not again set out on his travels. This imposed a certain moderation. He claimed no power to impose taxes not sanctioned by Parliament. He assented to the Habeas Corpus Act, which deprived the Crown of the power of arbitrary arrest. On occasion, he could flout the fiscal power of Parliament by means of subsidies from Louis XIV, but in the main he was a constitutional monarch. Most of the limitations of royal power, originally desired by the opponents of Charles I, were conceded at the Restoration, and were respected by Charles II because it had been shown that kings could be made to suffer at the hands of their subjects. James II, unlike his brother, was totally destitute of subtlety and finesse. By his bigoted Catholicism, he united against himself the Anglicans and Nonconformists, in spite of his attempts to conciliate the latter by granting them toleration in defiance of Parliament. Foreign policy also played a part. The Stuarts, in order to avoid the taxation required in wartime, which would have made them dependent upon Parliament, pursued a policy of subservience, first to Spain and then to France. The growing power of France roused the invariable English hostility to the leading continental state, and the revocation of the Edict of Nantes made Protestant feeling bitterly opposed to Louis XIV. In the end, almost everybody in England wished to be rid of James. But almost everybody was equally determined to avoid a return to the days of the Civil War and Cromwell's dictatorship. Since there was no constitutional way of getting rid of James, there must be a revolution, but it must be quickly ended so as to give no opportunity for disruptive forces. The rights of Parliament must be secured once for all. The king must go, but monarchy must be preserved. It should be, however, not a monarchy of divine right, but one dependent upon legislative sanction, and so upon Parliament. By a combination of aristocracy and big business, all this was achieved in a moment, without the necessity of firing a shot. Compromise and moderation had succeeded, after every form of intransigence had been tried and had failed. The new king, being Dutch, brought with him the commercial and theological wisdom for which his country was noted. The Bank of England was created, the national debt was made into a secure investment, no longer liable to repudiation at the caprice of the monarch. The Act of Toleration, while leaving Catholics and Nonconformists subject to various disabilities, put an end to actual persecution. Foreign policy became resolutely anti-French, and remained so, with brief intermissions until the defeat of Napoleon.